In Afghanistan, the Taliban have seized back power nearly 2 decades after 9/11, taking over the capital of Kabul. The Afghan president has fled the country, and U.S. troops have taken control of the city's airport, where thousands of Afghans are also desperate to leave the country. Military helicopters are evacuating American citizens and embassy personnel, as well as particularly vulnerable Afghan nationals. Senior correspondent Ian Pannell has the latest from Kabul.
This morning, mayhem in Kabul. This crowd rushing to the airport. Behind them, the sound of gunfire. The airport now overrun. Desperate, chaotic scenes as massive crowds surge onto the tarmac, desperate to get out of the country. And the US desperately trying to evacuate thousands of Americans living in Afghanistan and Afghans who've supported the US mission. Of those trying to escape, an American family who were visiting relatives in Afghanistan, and this morning, they're trapped.
We are trying to protect my kids and my mom. I have my senior mom here, both of my daughters, and we're just going through a disaster here.
The Afghan president also among those fleeing as the militants moved in, saying he wanted to save Kabul from bloodshed. This footage from Al Jazeera allegedly showing Taliban fighters inside the presidential palace, walking the hallways, declaring the restoration of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. Near the US Embassy, Chinook helicopters seen flying in and out, part of the massive evacuation of Americans. The embassy doors now shuttered. The American flag taken down. 1,000 additional soldiers now rerouted to Kabul in the wake of this chaotic turn of events. In less than 3 months, the Taliban capturing control of nearly every major district outside Kabul.
And Ian Pannell joins me live now from Kabul with more on this. Ian, what are you seeing there?
Yeah, well, Diane, we've been out onto the streets this morning. I have to say there are 2 stories in Kabul. One is the streets outside. Yesterday, they were totally dead. Today, we've seen traffic. We've seen pedestrians, people out on their bikes, people kind of starting to come out of their houses. But tellingly, we drove around for about 10, 15 minutes. We didn't see one woman out on the streets. Now, that wouldn't have been the case just 2 days ago, so I think that already tells you a lot. We're seeing Taliban manning checkpoints. We've seen pickup trucks heavily laden with Taliban fighters, their Kalashnikovs sticking out, looking at us, checking out who we are. We saw one Humvee with a Taliban fighter driving it through the town. We also met some Taliban fighters from neighboring Logar province and talked to them about what they plan to do over the coming days. They were trying to reassure us that they're not the bad guys, that they're here to bring stability and a better future for the country. But tellingly, he wouldn't answer any questions at all about whether the Taliban had changed from before, and he wouldn't answer any questions at all about women. Diane?
And Ian, we're seeing some disturbing scenes at the airport. I mean, people going so far as to trying to cling to planes that are taking off. How are officials dealing with this rush to flee the country?
Yeah, and that's the other side of what's going on in Kabul at the moment. We can hear the roar of aircraft. It is chaos down there. Yesterday, an Afghan friend went to the airport. The streets were so clogged. He went with his family, his 3 kids, that they had to ditch their suitcases and walk to the airport. Then someone tried to follow on with those suitcases. After 6 hours, still couldn't get there. Today, as you say, we've seen people invading the runway, running in front of US transport planes. Unfortunately, for everybody, this is now the abiding image of withdrawal. It is utter chaos, utter desperation. Why are they so desperate? Why are they clinging to airplanes? Because they genuinely believe, and with good cause, that if they stay here and the Taliban find them, then they'll be killed. But at the moment, there isn't a reasonable, decent plan, a schedule. The US, other NATO countries were caught totally off guard, and that's why we're seeing the panic and chaos there. They haven't even been able to secure the perimeter fence. That's why you're hearing gunshots in the air. It's mainly crowd control measures, extreme as they may be. I don't think those scenes are going to end. While the US is still here, still trying to get its citizens out, and Afghans who work with them, we're going to see those scenes of chaos and desperation, but really, really tragic.
And Ian, where will these refugees go? Will the US take them in?
Yeah, so basically the US at the moment has a two-pronged program. One is for the special immigrant visas for those people who work directly with the US mission here, whether it was diplomatic or Afghan interpreters who work with the US military. But we've heard repeatedly from people who've been applying for years, they haven't had a response, their confirmation hasn't come through, they can't get to the airport, not everybody was in Kabul anyway. The second group of people are people who've worked with US companies, media companies or NGOs, but they've been told, yes, you can apply for visa status as long as you make your own way out of the country. Well, that's just totally impossible at the moment. So that's partly to explain why we see a desperation. And that's just some of the people who can get out, and of course, that's just a small minority.
So what happens to those who are left behind?
That is the question, right? What does the new Afghanistan look like? What does Taliban rule look like? Now, I think consistently over the last few months, if not the last few years, while the Taliban leadership have been in Doha, while the US has been negotiating with them, we've seen two sides to the Taliban. The political leadership, which has, it's very politically savvy, it has a very different kind of nuanced message. It says they will respect women's rights, women will be allowed to go to work, we're allowed to go to be educated, to go to university. But the practice on the ground of the Taliban fighters is they're much more militant, much more hardline. I mean, we're hearing stories, they're not confirmed, the Taliban going house to house, looking for women who've worked with, say, the media, organizations like that, people being taken from their homes. The Taliban is saying they're going to restore order, they're not going to do that. But in this confused situation, there is real fear and panic for people left behind. And for the women in particular, what on earth does the future hold? Will the Taliban leadership's message hold, or will it be the word of the fighters on the streets?
All right, Ian Pannell in Kabul. Stay safe, Ian. Thank you. And earlier on Good Morning America, George Stephanopoulos spoke to retired General Douglas Lute, who oversaw the war in Afghanistan for Presidents Bush and Obama and is the former ambassador to NATO. He spoke about how concerned we need to be about the Taliban right now. Let's listen.
Since 2001, when we first went into Afghanistan. First of all, Al-Qaeda has changed. Al-Qaeda in the Afghanistan-Pakistan region, the original cause that took us to Afghanistan, is much diminished. In fact, I believe decimated from those early years. We brought bin Laden to justice 10 years ago in 2011. There are branches of Al-Qaeda that are today more dangerous to the United States than anything coming from Afghanistan. So Al-Qaeda in Somalia, Yemen, northeast Syria, parts of Africa. So Al-Qaeda has changed. But Martha also mentioned that American capability has changed. We have a network of global partners today to share information on counterterrorism. Our ability to detect terrorist threats and to do something about them, strike with precision anywhere in the world, is much, much improved than from 2001.
That is certainly the hope, but if we got if the intelligence about how quickly the Taliban would take over Afghanistan was so wrong, how can we trust it now?
Well, you should never trust intelligence. You should always question it. You should always probe the assumptions. And I think the last few days indicate that you can never rest on the most likely assessed scenario, but really have to plan for the worst case.
How do we deal with the Taliban now?
Well, it's too soon to tell, George. We're not sure what Taliban we have. There are those who fear that this is exactly a redux of the Taliban of 20 years ago, but there are indicators that they have changed. They clearly have a much more sophisticated view of the world. They have contacts with the outside world that they never had in 2001 when they ruled. They're much more politically savvy, much more media savvy than they were at that time. So we'll have to see. The first indication will be how they treat fellow Afghans.
You've devoted a significant part of your career to Afghanistan. You oversaw it, as we said, for Presidents Bush and Obama from the National Security Council. Thousands of American families have sacrificed in this war. What do you say to them about what was gained after 2 decades of war, billions of dollars in investment, thousands of lives lost?
right? That 20 years of investment, of American investment, has had benefits. We're not seeing those benefits today play out inside Afghanistan itself. But those 20 years bought us time to make ourselves a much harder terrorist target than we were in 2001. Think about the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of National Intelligence. We're sharing intelligence in a much more reasonable way today than we were pre-9/11. We have this global network of partners which help us protect ourselves from afar. Also, al-Qaeda is much different. As I mentioned, al-Qaeda in this region, Afghanistan and Pakistan, is much diminished, but it has franchises elsewhere. So these 20 years of service and sacrifice have given us the space and the time to make ourselves much more secure.
Our thanks to George and Ambassador Douglas Lute for that. And we should mention that numerous U.S. officials now tell ABC News that key intelligence assessments did predict the quick Taliban takeover. Our leaders just didn't listen. We're going to hear more from that, or on that, I should say, from President Biden's national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, in just a moment. Meanwhile, pressure, I should say, is growing for the Biden administration to do more in response to the turmoil in Afghanistan. President Biden and Vice President Harris met by video with the national security team yesterday to hear updates on the evacuation of our civilian personnel in Afghanistan. ABC's Stephanie Ramos is in Washington with more on that. Good morning, Stephanie.
Diane, President Biden entered the White House touting his decades of experience on the world stage. And when he announced the drawdown of U.S. troops in Afghanistan back in April, the first major foreign policy decision of his presidency, he assured Americans that Afghan forces could hold the line against the Taliban. This morning, that is not the reality. The president meeting virtually with his national security team from Camp David over the weekend. His critics vocal he has mishandled this crisis. The House and Senate were also briefed over the weekend on the situation by the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The president has not spoken publicly about the situation in Afghanistan in nearly a week, but he did put out a statement doubling down on his reasons for pulling American troops out of the country and saying he inherited a deal cut by former President Trump and that it has led to this current turmoil. Diane.
All right, Stephanie Ramos in Washington, thank you. And earlier on GMA, George also spoke to the president's national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, about whether or not there are threats from the Taliban and if we'll hear from the president today. Let's listen.
Just a month ago, the president said a Taliban takeover of Afghanistan was highly unlikely. Was the intelligence wrong, or did he dismiss it?
Well, the president did not think it was inevitable that the Taliban were going to take control of Afghanistan. He thought the Afghan National Security Forces could step up and fight because we spent 20 years, tens of billions of dollars training them, giving them the best equipment, giving them support of U.S. forces for 20 years. And when push came to shove, they decided not to step up and fight for their country. And so the question facing the president back in April, and again as we've gone forward, is should U.S. men and women be put into the middle of another country's civil war when their own army won't fight to defend them? And his answer to that question was no, and that is why he stands by this decision.
But then if he knew then that the army wasn't going to stand and fight, or why didn't he know that the army was going to stand and fight, and why wasn't more planning in place so that we could get out our allies and American personnel in a more deliberate manner?
Well, with respect to the planning, we planned for a wide range of contingencies. One of those was the need to flow in a substantial number of forces to secure the airport and be able to facilitate that evacuation. We have now successfully drawn down the U.S. Embassy in Kabul. We have moved all of those personnel either to the airport or out of the country. And we flowed in several thousand troops who had been pre-positioned in theater for precisely this purpose. He activated that deployment well before the fall of Kabul because as we watched the situation unfold, and it certainly unfolded at unexpected speed, we put that contingency plan in place.
But we're still seeing thousands of our allies, interpreters, translators, other aides to the U.S. effort there in Afghanistan who are stranded. Can they be saved?
We believe that we can effectuate an ongoing evacuation of American citizens, of Afghans who worked for us, including interpreters and translators, and other vulnerable Afghans at risk. We are working to do that, first by securing the airport today, and then in the days ahead by taking people out one flight at a time, flight after flight. We fully intend to continue an evacuation process to bring out people who worked alongside of us in Afghanistan.
We're getting reports that the Taliban are releasing hundreds of prisoners from the Bagram prison there who are al-Qaeda sympathizers. Are we going to be able to engage with the Taliban? How are we going to prevent those terrorists from targeting America again?
Well, first, I would say that we have to look at the terrorism threat in a broad context, which is that we are facing terrorist threats in countries around the world, including Syria and Libya and Yemen. And one thing we have proven in those countries, in Somalia, in other parts of the world, is that we can fight terrorism effectively without having a large military footprint on the ground. We are going to prove that as well in Afghanistan. And yes, we are going to hold the Taliban accountable to not allowing al-Qaeda to have a safe haven there. And if they do, there will be costs and consequences for the Taliban in addition to the direct suppression of al-Qaeda that we will have the capability to pursue in the period ahead.
What do you say to Americans who are wondering what was achieved by 2 decades of war, thousands of casualties, billions of dollars in investment?
I would say that we went to Afghanistan for one reason, which is to get the people who attacked us on 9/11. A decade ago, we got Osama bin Laden. We degraded al-Qaeda. We stopped terrorist attacks against the United States from Afghanistan for 20 years. But what the president was not prepared to do was enter a third decade of conflict, flowing in thousands more troops, which was his only other choice, to fight in the middle of a civil war that the Afghan army wouldn't fight for itself. He would not do that to America's men and women or their families, and that is why he made the decision to withdraw U.S. forces from Afghanistan this year.
Should the American people expect to hear from the president today?
I think they can expect to hear from the president soon. He is right now actively engaged with his national security team. He is working the situation hard. He is focused on ensuring that the mission, which is to secure that airport and to continue these evacuations, that mission continues and is brought to a positive conclusion. That is his overriding focus right now. He's deeply engaged on it. And yes, at the right point, he will absolutely address the American people.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.